There's a guy who wants to talk to you. Is he listening? Serious?
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Fully Opposable, and in this one I'm going to discuss moon landing hoax accusations. Now, this is actually a response to a podcast by my friend Dark Hater. In a couple of different podcasts, he's mentioned the moon landing being a hoax, and in response to an email, in podcast number 22, I was brought into the mix.
You know what? I was arguing with my homeboy, and this dude don't believe in any conspiracy. But we've been going back and forth on that moon shit. I personally don't believe that we sent men to the moon in 1969. There's a great documentary called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon that you can look up.
So, knowing several of his listeners might watch this film on his request, I set out to do the same in order to give another point of view. And I also wanted to show how easily you can debunk this stuff. I took an hour to watch this 47-minute video. I stopped every so often to take notes. And I took another 45 minutes to an hour grabbing some reference images and checking numbers. I wasn't quite sure that I had right. And the thing is, films like this are so filled with mistakes and outright lies, it's actually very simple to disprove them. Much of the film's time is taken up by unsupported allegations, like the astronauts are afraid to talk, and those aren't worth talking about, so I'm just going to focus on its so-called evidence. So let's watch this movie. Roughly the first 12 minutes are useless. There are 5 minutes of verses about the exposing of truth and a montage of images, talk of conflicts, and then some quotes from Kennedy and von Braun. And there are no citations on these quotes, so you don't know when they were said. And that is to give the viewer a sense that right up until the day the rockets fired, no one of authority believed that the technology to go to the moon even existed. So it tries to make its real case with the Van Allen belts. Now, the Van Allen belts are areas of high energy particles that are trapped in the Earth's magnetic field. They speak of them as if they're the worst thing since H-bomb, and it culminates with this.
In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required.
Now, this is just factually incorrect. The belts are dangerous, but they have areas that are less dense and less dangerous, and we target those areas in our travel. Secondly, heavy metal shielding is not best because it can cause secondary radiation. Light metals and plexiglass are actually better, and that is what NASA had.
The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum.
Now, you notice it says the narrowest shielding, not the thickest shielding or even the average shielding. But even if all the shielding was that thin, the astronauts would have been protected from a dangerous dose of radiation. That's not even counting the fact that the astronauts had the rest of the ship around them as well. The video goes on to overstate new info on the Van Allen belts that came about in 1998, and that was when scientists learned that the belts shifted in a way that they weren't prepared for and needed to put into their preparations. They make some accusations without any evidence. They show more Kennedy footage and conclude that it was a fact that NASA couldn't pull off this mission and set out to commit a hoax. Let's see. Next, they appeal to our hatred of fat cats and corporations and imply that the money should have gone to the poor, and none of this is actual factual evidence. It's emotional manipulation in order to get you to feel a certain way and be more accepting of their theory. And that's next, they cite some conspiracies that they believe already happened, and they try to use that as proof of their current conspiracy. And that's not how things work. Just because conspiracy X happened, it doesn't give any credence to conspiracy Y. Your evidence has to stand on its own. Then come some what-if questions, a claim of victimhood to NASA, and they slander Neil Armstrong, but none of that is evidence or worth discussing. Now, at this point, they start to blatantly show their ignorance.
Straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used.
So this is 100% wrong. First, they say, regardless of the landscape, and that's false. Landscape does alter the appearance of shadow direction, which you can actually see in the image they show. The landscape of the yard is sloped, making the shadows appear to veer off in different directions. Secondly, they're ignoring what all artists understand. The vanishing point, the spot that represents infinity, where parallel lines appear to converge and gives us that look of perspective. It's this perspective that makes parallel lines in this building that I photographed appear to converge in this photograph. As for shadows made by the sun, as you can see in these photos here that I took myself, shadows from sunlight converge, even though technically they are nearly parallel. In fact, the example of parallel shadows that they use are not parallel. Using their own arrows, if you give yourself enough room, you can see they actually converge. We won't even get into what happens to shadows when an object isn't straight up and down. One last thing about casting shadows. If a light source is relatively close to the objects, the shadows will actually diverge from one another, like my photo here.
In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this. Only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon.
Some of these photos were obviously on sloping or curved terrain. And as for the hotspots, did any of you notice the hotspots in my photos? All of these things they say shouldn't happen actually are what happened in reality. Their so-called evidence of fakery is actually evidence of fact.
Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module.
How can this be? Well, just because there's a shadow, it doesn't mean there's no light. You can stand in the shadow of a building and see, right? And why can you still see? Because light is bouncing off the things around you and back to you. And the astronaut suits are a very bright white. They and the metal equipment are reflecting the light coming off the surface of the moon. In fact, if light is shining on an object, it becomes shaded on the opposite side from the light source. And this astronaut is shaded on his upper surfaces because light is coming from up from the moon's surface.
In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out.
Papier-mâché prop. Okay, first, this is not a crease. Do you not see this line of a shadow right here that continues up onto the rock? Whatever's making this shadow is the actual culprit. Now, for the letter C, this doesn't really look like it's on the rock. It looks like it's something that happened during the reproduction of the photo. And so on other reproductions of the photo, it doesn't have it.
That's my job! That's what I do! I don't lose! I win! Is there no one on this planet to even challenge me?
Maybe you came by to congratulate me on last night's victory.